Hi, students. Um, Welcome to the lecture on Iran and the 1953 coup. I hope that you're all doing well. And just by way of reminder, you're welcome to post on forums any questions you have about this material. And I also wanted to just remind you where you can find some of this material. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Here we're in our track site. Go to resources. Folks, we're in week 12. Monday is focusing on the country of Iran. Wednesday, we're focusing on Syria and the Syrian war in particular. Under Monday, here you have a Word document and a link of the same assigned reading about US-Iranian relations. You have BBC overview of US-Iranian relations. I'll be drawing on some of that, both of those articles in the lecture today. And then here you have an assignment, which is really one of the most important things. I want you to actually start your work for today by listening to this 37-minute podcast by NPR that talks about the US CIA's role in the 1953 coup in Iran. And I want you to fill out, as you're reading along, a worksheet that I have posted. Actually, I see that I still need to post that. I'll do that right now. You have a series of questions. I was actually taking some notes myself. A series of questions for you to be filling out and typing in as you listen to that 37-minute podcast. Okay, so what I would like you to do to start out your work is actually to listen to that podcast and to fill out the worksheet. Okay. So after you have listened to that podcast, then please come back and listen to this lecture. I will have a little bit of an overview of the 53 coup, but I'm going to also situate the 53 coup in some other more contemporary interactions between the United States and Iran. And remember, folks, we're thinking about the history of Cold War relations and the geopolitical configurations and power relations that have defined the world and global geopolitics from the 1950s until the period of 1989, when the Cold War officially ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. Nonetheless, the United States and Iran continue to have contentious relations. And I hope in this lecture to provide some historical context on those relations. I also want you to continue to think critically and carefully about the role of the US government around the world and the impact of that history, how that history lives in the present today. And I've also assigned an extra credit that I want to point out to you. After you've done the NPR podcast and then you've listened to this lecture, for those of you who are interested, I have created an extra credit assignment that entails watching this hour-long Rick Steves episode. He's a travel writer and television personality, and I would like to encourage you to watch this hour-long Rick Steves special. And then after you do so, go to assignments. In assignments, you're going to have an extra credit option. And what you're going to do is you're going to answer a set of 3 questions. I actually have them in the PowerPoint. I'm asking you to comment on something that surprises you, both about the urban and sort of natural or rural landscapes, just how places in Iran look. Many of us haven't been to Iran. Maybe no one in our class of 118 people has been to Iran. So this is your chance to sort of see what contemporary life looks like in Iran. I ask you to comment on contemporary life, something that's surprising or that was unexpected about everyday life and perhaps gender relations. And then lastly, number 3, I'm asking you to just give another comment or question that watching that hour-long documentary raises for you. So you're going to get 2 extra credit points to your score out of 50 on exam number 3, the final exam that we take on May 13th. I'm going to give you 2 extra credit points to add to the total of that final grade. And you can complete this assignment, this extra credit option, before May 9th. But I would also encourage you to do it this week because it's going to help you understand this week's material. So let's go ahead and get into the lecture on Iran. Let me see, I need to share my screen with you. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so this lecture is going to be a bit short because I'm asking you to do, for certain, required the 37-minute podcast, but and filling out those worksheets. You will not submit those worksheets for any credit. They're just study guides for you to help you engage with the podcast and prepare for the exam. Okay, so this is a shorter lecture, but hopefully it will flesh out some of the questions that you have about what happens after the 1953 coup. And I've heard about the 1979 revolution in Iran, which is another huge moment in terms of U.S.-Iranian relations. But you know, I want you to have some of that context. That 79 revolution, the Islamic revolution, when Iran becomes a theocracy ruled by a religious figure rather than a secular figure. That's covered in the podcast, but of course the other reading that you did for today brings us up to date with Iran and US relations. So let's jump into it, people. Okay. Be moving myself around here to work with the PowerPoint. Okay, so here, thinking about this 53 coup, the moment of the Cold War, and the Cold War and the US's need to show its strength on the international stage is a huge contributor to US involvement in the 53 coup. And even though, again, like Guatemala, the democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, was not a communist. And it's clear with evidence that he was not a communist. Nonetheless, the fear of his nationalization, the economic impact that Mossadegh's nationalization of the oil companies in Iran, that played a huge role in motivating the United States in the context of the Cold War to support a military intervention that ousted the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 and installed the Shah, an authoritarian monarch who ruled until the 1979 revolution, where now the Muslim clergy and the Ayatollah, the highest ranking member in Iran, is in charge of both the religious and the governmental sectors in society. Okay, so that's where we're headed. That's the overview. I think that the podcast that I know that you have already watched, it does a brilliant job of saying that it wasn't just about World War II and oil, that the discovery of oil in Iran goes back to 1908, and that there was an authoritarian dynasty, a monarchy, a dynasty that was in place at the time in Iran that basically just made money. This monarchy, this dynasty made money selling off Iran's natural resources to Western powers. And it was in these early moments in the 1900s that the Iranian Anglo Oil Company is founded, and the the UK basically owned this company, the Iranian Anglo Oil Company that later becomes BP. And Mossadegh in the early 1950s, in 1951, he nationalizes oil production in Iran. He basically tells BP, what's now BP, that the company wasn't going to be giving away all of its oil and all of its profits. And this is the set of the wheels, the forces that are set into motion that ultimately lead to the CIA-backed coup. It's a very similar story to the one that we saw with United Fruit, but in this case, the resource at stake and Western control over the resources, not bananas, but oil. So, okay, after World War II, during World War II, as the podcast explains, Iran's oil was used to fund the war effort in Britain in particular. And indeed, this is sort of another moment in this history of the UK's ownership, dependence, profiting off of Iranian oil resources. And the coup, which follows in 1953 after the 1951 nationalization of the oil by Mossadegh, basically ousts him. The Shah is put back in power, as you heard. The Shah, a monarch, out of this history of monarchies in Iran. Both the United States and the UK played a role in orchestrating the coup, in building up the political will for the coup, but ultimately it was the United States and the CIA under the leadership of Kermit Roosevelt that orchestrated a failed coup attempt followed by a successful coup attempt in 1953. Okay, so I think I've been going on quite a bit here. Okay, so yes, Mossadegh becomes prime minister in 51. He is democratically elected, and one of the things that he does, as I mentioned, is that he nationalizes oil production in Iran. And I think the podcast said something like 90% of the profits, 90 to 85% of the profits of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company went to BP rather than as a source of revenue for the Iranian state to improve the livelihoods of its citizens. And that's certainly what Mossadegh felt those oil resources and revenues should support rather than the profit margins of BP. And this was the nationalization of the oil, the straw that broke the camel's back. And the Brits began to reach out to the United States to coordinate a military action that would lead to Mossadegh's removal and the installation of a more pro-Western government. So the podcast does a brilliant job of getting into the details over the half an hour of this coup and the role that the United States plays. And one of the other factors, apart from the Cold War and the US's desire to exert authority on the global scale, defending its economic interests, the economic interests of powerful US companies and the economic interests of US allies. And remember, Iran at this point also shared a border with the Soviet Union. One of the other factors that leads to this coup coming to fruition is the election of Eisenhower in 53. And of course, you might remember from the Guatemalan lecture that Eisenhower was president when Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown with CIA support in Guatemala. So Eisenhower was definitely a president who sought to preemptively use the power of the US to flex some muscle and protect US economic interests. Kermit Roosevelt was a CIA officer who coordinated and led the coup. And The UK was also involved. The UK also played a big role in drumming up this narrative that Iran had communist Soviet leanings, and that Mossadegh was a communist, despite his democratic election and his party affiliation, which was not with the Communist Party that did exist in this time, but he was not a member of it. And you hear in that podcast too that one of the roles of these campaigns to oust these democratically elected leaders is a campaign of misinformation. And what the CIA was doing in that time, and this was happening in the UK, was that bad press was being published in the United States about Mossadegh, and then actually reporters in Iran were picking up and recirculating this campaign of misinformation. But the Brits did not actually lead the actual efforts on the ground. That was led by the CIA, and the CIA did in 2013 publicly acknowledge its role in Mossadegh's overthrow and the installation of the Shah into power. But the UK government has been a little bit more ambivalent in coming clean about its role, although the BBC around the same time period has been looking at government documents and messages and broadcasting and doing some investigative journalism on the role of the UK government in Mossadegh's ousting. Okay, so here, again, if you haven't, this is the time when I want you to stop this video and go listen to this 37-minute podcast. It's brilliantly produced, and I want you to take that Word document with you and be maybe typing up some answers alongside listening to that podcast. And just here's sort of a key set of ideas that are covered about the actual details. And basically, the podcast recounts with more finesse and detail than I can here that in '53 there was a first coup attempt that was unsuccessful. And basically, well, what's also really interesting in Iran is that there's the prime minister who is head of the secular government. This is Mossadegh. And then there's the Shah, who's a king, a monarch, and then there's the leader, the religious of the Muslim religious component of society, and that's the Ayatollah. So it's kind of like in the UK, how there's a monarch and a prime minister, but also in Iran, there's a really powerful figure, the Ayatollah, that in some ways would be like the role of the Pope in the past in terms of being, and still today the Pope is a really influential political figure. But that's the sort of, triangle of governance, of influencing society. And the Shah, the monarch, knew that he was going to get blamed for this coup attempt of the prime minister. There had been some tensions there that were exploited, right? And basically the CIA was bribing the Shah to start talking poorly about Prime Minister Mossadegh. And so when the first coup attempt fails, the Shah, the monarch, the king, he leaves and ultimately goes to Italy, right, where I'm sure he had property. The Brits back out, but the CIA continues to move forward. There's a second military coup. This time, the CIA, led by Kermit Roosevelt, hires a gang of thugs to stage these protests, to go through burning businesses, causing destruction, and chanting pro-Mossadegh slogans. And basically, the CIA funded this rogue group of gangs to go through the streets of Tehran and to create havoc, and then hired another gang who were acting as pro-Mossadegh supporters to get into a violent clash. And then he had both of those gangs go to Mossadegh's home. And in the chaos, Mossadegh knows that he's going to be killed. That's the intention. He's snuck out the back of the house, and ultimately Kermit Roosevelt goes to get this general that he's hand chosen to be the interim leader, and then this general hands over power to the Shah, who then restores the flow of oil to the West and Western domination of Iranian oil supplies. But here's the deal, folks. The Shah, he was a friend of the West, but he was hated in Iran because of his corruption, because of his wealth, his opulence, because of the fact that he used military power to quell dissent, to quell protesters. Basically, he was a corrupt leader, and he was a puppet of the United States, and the Iranian people basically overthrew him. And they did so in the name of Mossadegh. And as part of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, what's interesting is that the Iranian clergy seized this moment, the revolution of 1979 in Iran. It looked like there might be a democratic government installed once the monarchy, authoritarian government of the Shah was removed. But the clergy seized this moment to create an Islamic state. And the podcast does a really brilliant job of revealing how the creation of the Islamic State in 1979 in Iran was not the fulfillment of religiously pious Islamic people who desired this outcome, but rather was the result of a power play between these different forces that had been vying for power in Iran for some time. So the Iranian Revolution, the US-backed Shah of Iran, is forced to leave the country on January 16th, following months of demonstrations and strikes against his rule by both secular and religious opponents. 2 weeks later, the Islamic religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini returns from exile. Following a referendum, the Islamic Republic of Iran is proclaimed on April 1st. Now, shortly thereafter, there actually was during this revolution that the let me move this here, the the Iranian hostage crisis unfolded. Now, the podcast argues that one of the reasons that more extreme groups within the revolution occupied the U.S. embassy was that there was fear that the U.S. was going to intervene once again and reinstate the Shah in '79 after the revolution had ousted him. Others claim that this was not based on that fear, but radical elements of the revolution that took hostages. But horribly, in 1979 until 1981, there were 52 hostages that were held and then released following this long, extended moment, this horrible moment in which U.S., Americans, and other nationalities held as hostages for 444 days. And so after this hostage crisis, what's quite interesting to the shock of many was the Iran-Contra scandal. We talked about this really briefly when we were talking about the Northern Triangle. Remember, the Northern Triangle is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we were talking about U.S. military involvement in Central America in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And we're coming back to this moment because we're thinking about these connections between the United States, Iran, and also what's happening in Central America in the 1980s. This is what the Cold War was all about, these geopolitical games, all in the name of fighting communism. But in all of these places where the US claimed to be fighting communism, what came in the wake of these military interventions was not democracy, but military dictatorships, right? Led by generals in Central America and by the Shah in Iran. So back to the Iran-Contra scandal. Following the hostage crisis, you can imagine that Congress had banned the United States from selling any weapons or having diplomatic relations. There are no relations with Iran at this time. But Ronald Reagan authorizes, in exchange for help with freeing these U.S. hostages held at the U.S. Embassy, Reagan negotiates the sale of weapons to Iran. And Iran, at this moment in the 1980s, is engaged in a long, horrific war with Iraq. And we're going to be coming back on Wednesday when we talk about the Syrian war, how all of these alliances that are being developed in the 1980s, this moment, influences the Syrian war today. Okay. So the Iran-Contra scandal, the United States sells weapons to Iran as a way to get money to send to the Contras who are fighting against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So the Congress basically had said to Reagan at this time, we're no longer using US taxpayer dollars to engage and support military conflict in Central America. You're not authorized to spend that money. At the same time that it was prohibited for the US to sell weapons to Iran, sanctions based on the 79 revolution as well as the hostage crisis. But Reagan sees a way to go around all of this and basically sells weapons to Iran, and with this money, gives this money to the Contras, who are based out of Honduras and other places where the US has military presence and lots of bases, to fund these Contras who are engaged in a war in Nicaragua to try to oust the Sandinista government to the tune of $30 million, right? 18 of which was given to the Contras. So this was a political crisis for Reagan, and some high-ranking people were indicted, but Reagan and Oliver North, who was involved in this as well, were not sanctioned. In 1988, another moment of tense relations between Iran and the United States. The United States in 1988, an American warship shot down a civilian airjet, an Airbus. 290 civilians, including 66 children, died as a result of that American warship shooting down an airplane, an Iranian airplane. The US claimed that it was a mistake, that the airplane was mistaken for a fighter jet. But this was a moment that really created, I mean, could you imagine if you were in Iran's position, right? Just a normal college student in Iran, and a foreign entity shoots down a plane with 266 people. It was a real blow to US-Iranian relations. And a lot of anti-US sentiment is a result of this. And in 2002, George Bush denounces, this is very much part of a lot of preemptive warfare, sort of looking back in 2002, knowing that the US is going to invade Iraq on the pretense of weapons of mass destruction just a couple years later, but just setting that aside for a moment. 2002, in his State of the Union address, President George Bush declares that Iran is part of an axis of evil that includes Iraq and North Korea. And this, again, is sort of another doubling down on this discourse of anti-Americanism, anti-Iranian feelings in the United States. And following these heightened tensions, there's concern about the reinstatement of the development of uranium enrichment. Basically, uranium is the fuel that goes into nuclear weapons. And so there was a lot of concern during this tension, this rising tension. And what's also really important for you to understand is that Iran historically has been an enemy of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, since 1973, when the US and Saudi Arabia get really cozy, when the Saudis start putting their petrodollars, their profits from the oil in 1973 in US banks, the Saudis and the United States economically have had a very close relationship. And so the US has always been allied with the Saudis in the Middle East since this moment, and Iran is an enemy of Saudi Arabia. And so in this sort of moment of tensions, there's concerns about nuclear enrichment and proliferation in the 2000s. And the United States is also engaging in economic sanctions against Iran at this time. Under the Obama administration there, and also under the leadership of a newly elected president, Hassan Rouhani, who he follows a very radical, very inflammatory president of Iran. This president is much more moderate and really reaches out to the Obama administration. First time since the hostage crisis of 1979 that two heads of state of Iran and the United States get on the phone together. And in 2015, Obama negotiates basically a program, a nuclear deal with Iran to lift economic sanctions in return for a deactivation of the enrichment and nuclear program in Iran. And this includes opening up the country, documents, facilities, infrastructure to be inspected to make sure that Iran is complying with its nuclear deal. In 2008, President Trump abandons the nuclear deal. He reinstates economic sanctions against Iran, and he's threatening to do so to countries and firms that continue to buy Iranian oil. This causes an economic recession in Iran. Relations between the US and Iran worsen in 2019 when the US tightens the sanctions targeting Iranian oil exports. In response, Iran begins a counter-pressure campaign. And then in May and June of 2019, you might remember this, it was almost a year ago, there was an explosion of oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. And the US blames Iran, despite the fact that Iran denounces responsibility. And in June, on June 20th, Iranian forces shoot down a US military drone over the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow little strait that is actually a funnel, a tunnel for 40% of all of the world's oil supplies that are basically leaving the Middle East and going to the rest of the world. And the United States has long claimed that it will use its military power to make sure that the oil flows and that those international waters are allowed for the traffic for oil. And so when you see sort of this Strait of Hormuz, it's really about controlling the flow of oil. I mean, it's amazing to be thinking for me whenever I hear this story, just how, especially even going back to Britain, British influence and involvement in what is known as Iran today from the early 1900s. It has everything to do with the fact that we are a fossil fuel based economy. And therefore, he who controls or she who controls the fossil fuel controls the economy. And this has made the Middle East a site of strategic economic importance and thus military intervention on the part of countries like the US. And then really interestingly, if you remember there, I forgot to include here that in early January 2020, the US assassinated a general, Khomeini, in, I think that's what his name was. I'd have to go back and look, sorry. A top Iranian general, I think number 3 in the country, was assassinated at US hands. And it seemed like we were on a clear path to war. This was early January of this year. And then the Iranian government shoots down a plane, its own plane, an Iranian plane that had hundreds of civilians. And argues that it thought it was a US plane, a US warplane or something. And I think if it hadn't been for that horrible tragedy, that things probably would have escalated further. Okay, so I want to just follow up and end the conversation here with your extra credit assignment. Okay, so remember, you must, please listen to the podcast. Fill out the questions. You're not turning in those questions, but you will be able to get some extra credit if you do this separate assignment, which asks you to watch a video by Rick Steves, an hour-long video that will take you to Iran. And you can see what Tehran looks like. There's lots of interesting conversations he has with people about US-Iranian relations. And all I'm asking you to do is to follow this link here and watch the video. And then I want you to answer in 150 words. That's just one paragraph, 2 sentences for each of these questions, right? What do you find most surprising about Iranian urban and rural landscapes? What do you find most interesting about contemporary life or gender relations in Iran? What other questions or comments about Iran, US-Iranian relations does this video raise for you? I just think it's a fantastically done video. I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a nice way to contribute to our goal, which is to sort of rethink the history of these places, understand how they have been deeply connected to not only the United States, but to other geopolitical forces. We'll come back to that, talking about the Syrian civil war, like Guatemala. Syrian civil war is not a civil war at all, in the sense that it is between 2 fighting fractions within a country. What you see in Syria is basically sets of geopolitical alliances, all the way from Saudi Arabia. You have Russia involved, you have the United States. All of these actors are playing war games and engaging in war amongst Turkey, war amongst themselves in Syria, over Syria, and in this moment. So we'll be thinking about that, but please do watch that video and take advantage of the extra credit. I really just want you to take the hour and watch the video after you do the podcast, and take a look at the readings and watch this PowerPoint. Okay, so I will be posting your next lecture on Wednesday by noon. I hope that you're all doing great. And of course, you can find me in forums or in office hours on Thursday, 1 to 2. I hope that you're all doing well.